Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today, well really not today, I did it this weekend, during one of my days off because I try to do some fun stuff, some active recovery, GPP, different stuff on my 3 days off from training, and usually the weekends are two of those days. So I thought I would mess a little bit with some isometrics. Now, I kind of got the idea for this when I watched quite a while back, and yes, I've seen it over a year ago, and I've watched it a couple times, was when Stephanie Cohen went over to Westside, and she was chatting with Louis Simmons, and he had her do some isometric pulls in the rack, specifically with her sumo pull. And one of the things that I've noticed that for me is that I do have some mobility issues at the bottom of the sumo pull. And I have different muscles I know that I need to build for that, but what is it that builds mobility? Where does mobility come from? Strength, right? Mobility is not a flexibility problem. It's a strength deficit. We have weak muscles. And in my case, me doing wider and wider stance box squats will help me get better at sumo pulling out of the bottom. And I realized, doing some isometric work like this out of the bottom wouldn't be a bad idea. It's something I could just work with. I can pull myself into those positions. Because when we do something like this, what are we doing? We're having to take a weight that we can't lift, right? This is an immovable object as far as I'm concerned. I cannot deadlift 755. So I threw that on my stiff bar, wrapped up. Now I only recorded 5 sets of this. I did 6. I recorded 5 of them. You'll see them loop through here over and over. I'm obviously pulling a little harder and longer on some of them. As I did a couple, then I started actually trying to count seconds of how many seconds I could pull against it before I turned loose. And as I did these, I noticed different muscles. But people would say, well, what's the point? Why are you doing this? Well, I'm pulling myself into that stretch position at the bottom of a sumo. Because what is a sumo deadlift? A sumo deadlift is a wide stance squat, really. That's what it is. Yes, it's technically a hip hinge, but it's the most squatty out of any deadlift. All right, a lot of people think that the trap bar is, but that's just simply not true. Trap bar is not as close to a squat as a sumo deadlift is. It's not even a hybrid between a squat and a deadlift like people try to make it out to be. There was a time when I thought that was kind of the case, but I looked further at the data and realized it's not. The sumo is the closest thing we have to a hybrid. But the problem that a lot of us run into is that, in my case, I have a strength deficiency at those ankles. And even that's the deepest I can pull myself. Like I'm actually having to pull myself into that position, strapped up so that grip's not an issue, and just pulling as hard as I can. Why? What are we doing? Because we're exerting maximum force at the terminal end of my range of motion and pulling myself into that position and then pulling as hard as I can. Now this is fairly easy to recover from. That's part of the beauty of it. We don't get the same structural loading on something like this that we get on some movements. And again, getting into a joint angle that you need to get stronger at and doing isometric work against an immovable object, whether it's pin presses, pin squats. You could do the same thing with a squat, couldn't you? Do the same thing with a squat. You could load it up at your sticking point where you know you need that extra strength, maybe 4 inches out of the hole. You could take a weight that exceeds your 1 rep max, maybe even put another 100 pounds on it, and then get up against that point and just squat as hard as you can. What does that do? Well, we get joint angle specificity. We are maximizing muscle fiber recruitment at that point where we stick. We're using the muscle specifically involved. Okay, now what else does something like this do? Well, it teaches us to strain and work the muscles at that point. It also helps us identify the point in the movement. So if I get up there and I pull as hard as I can against that sumo deadlift, I actually find the hip angles and the positions to where I can exert maximum force against that immovable object. Well, what does that mean? That means that that's going to teach me the hip angle and hip position that I need if I want to break a heavy sumo off the floor later. Because that's where the sumo is hardest. That's why I lift like this. It works good on something like this, because the sumo deadlift is hardest off the floor. But right there, I noticed as I did these, I felt certain muscles. On the first set, I felt my abductors strain ridiculously hard. I realized, okay, my abductors are definitely an issue for me. They're a weak link. That's why I don't have the mobility to sumo deadlift perfectly. You guys have seen me pull 600 off some blocks and stuff like that. But I conventional more. They should be pretty close to the same unless you have some glaring leverage advantages on one versus the other. Most people, they're sumo and they're conventional. If you have even muscle development through your body, they should be pretty close to each other. Barring people who are just built for one more than the other, which are the exception, not the norm. But this let me do that. And then it let me start noticing what other muscles am I feeling when I do this. Because the first set, it was extremely pronounced. I felt it in that one spot. Of course, I realized I need to work on that more. Well, we're working on that by working on wider and wider stance box squats. There's part of my solution. But I've also realized that to do sumo, I'm going to need to do speed pulls with sumos. I'm doing deficit deadlifts right now. But speed pulls with this would help me a lot. But I struggle to get into the position. This will teach me to get into that position. Maybe it's something I'll come do once a week for a little while. Learn to pull myself into that spot. Because if I can get into that same spot where I'm straining and then explode, right? That's what we want. But I also noticed the further I got into it, I started feeling other muscles. Second, third, fourth set. Then I started noticing other things. My adductors, which is the inner thigh, not the outer hip up there. The abductor is the one up at the top, the outside of your hip. Started noticing more of those. Noticing a certain part of my hamstring. Then I noticed, well, it's hard to tell between my lower lat and my lower traps. I was okay, that needs work too then, doesn't it? I want to be able to break off the floor explosively. That's part of it, is that having to pull against that, it's pulling really hard against my ability to maintain scapular retraction. So we have to look at what parts of the back are then involved. So basically doing something like this can do a few things for me. It can build mobility. Because again, you come over to something like that, I'm actually maximally exerting force at nearly the terminal end of my range of motion because I'm having to pull myself into that position. Well, that'll give a training effect. That'll give us carryover. That's how you build mobility, is to strain hard. And I don't mean a stretch. It needs to be actual loaded work near the terminal end of your range of motion. That's how we build mobility. That's why good mornings build hamstring mobility so quickly. You get a stretch reflex. Okay. Again, pronounced training effect, and it's easy to recover from. This isn't the same as pulling a max deadlift where you move the weight and then you have all that weight on your body. In this case, it's pulling against it and mainly just using muscle. But the muscle fibers involved, they can get a training response from this. If you strain hard for a good 6 seconds, which I did on some of these, and exert maximum force, you learn to grind and pull at that point. And we build the muscle involved at that point. Something like this also lets us identify our weaker muscles. So when we get into the correct position, which muscles hurt? What's limiting us? Maybe those need more work if I need to do this. So again, it let me kind of assess my own weak links on the sumo deadlift, particularly, again, breaking it off the floor, which is our weak link. It's my weak link. Okay. But things like this is what we have to be willing to do, guys. If you want to get strong, we have to be willing to use every tool available to us. We have to be willing to try new things. We have to innovate if we want to get strong. We have to innovate. And I'm not saying this is new. I'm not saying tons of people don't already do isometrics. I'm not saying it hasn't been used by strength athletes since before I was born, because it has. But trying to find intelligent uses for these tools, guys. If we wish to pursue elite levels of strength and we do not have top tier genetics, and I don't, we have to be willing to try new things. And I thought this would be fun. It was fun to do. Something to do a little bit different. Something to do on my off days. I don't normally film the stuff I do on my off days for you guys, because I come up with a lot of different stuff to practice, things to work on. Before I do them on camera, a lot of times I practice things on my off days before I start doing them in the normal workouts for you guys to see. But I thought I would just share this one with you guys because it's something I did, something I wanted to work on, and so that people kind of get an idea of the different things that I experiment with over time before they actually, hit my normal training. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.